Good evening and welcome. I'm Harold Holzer, and I have the honor of serving as director of Roosevelt House. And on behalf of Hunter College President Jennifer Rabb, I want to welcome you this evening. I'm glad it's cool down here. It's trying to keep it cool. Your attendance tonight makes it clear that, as David Margolick explores in his compelling new book, the story of Dr. King and Robert Kennedy and how they met their end in 1968, 50 years ago, is still causing irreparable pain, but they wouldn't have recognized the cell phones going off. So while I'm doing the introduction, please silence all of your devices. Just check them one more time. Yet as often as we've all rehashed the events that took place just 62 days apart in 1968, David Margolick has presented in The Promise and the Dream an untold story that lives up to the subtitle that you will be able to see this evening when we flash the cover on the screen. And I know tonight you will agree we will hear a revealing discussion. Now, I know you all know the Roosevelt House drill. Our conversation tonight will be capped by a question and answer period during which we will ask all of you, even those with much stronger voices than mine, to wait for the microphone we will bring to you because we are recording this for our students and we're live streaming it and recording it for YouTube. And then following the Q&A, we will adjourn to the Four Freedoms room upstairs, where we are delighted to host a reception and book sale. And I know you will want to obtain an autographed copy of The Promise and the Dream. Before I introduce tonight's speakers, I also want to alert you and invite you to use some of your time upstairs to preview the new art exhibit that we are officially set to open on Thursday. It's called Reimagining the Four Freedoms, and it's meant as a complement to the New York Historical Society's new show of the iconic Norman Rockwell paintings, in which he visualized Roosevelt's Four Freedoms. In our show, a jury chose among hundreds of entries to select 39 works by diverse contemporary artists, including Rockwell's granddaughter, by the way, Daisy Rockwell, in which those same themes are explored from fresh perspectives, some of them completely original, some of them riffs on the famous Rockwell paintings. And we're very proud that the labels include comments by our students in both the human rights and public policy programs. So have a look. But first, the main event of the evening. David Margolick has spent 2 decades writing brilliant pieces and columns and editing for Vanity Fair and The Times, specializing in legal affairs, and earning 4 nominations for the Pulitzer Prize. His many books, which are listed in your program, include Dreadful, The Short Life and Gay Times of John Horn Burns, Elizabeth and Hazel, 2 Women of Little Rock, Joe Lewis and Max Schmeling, and A World on the Brink, and Strange Fruit, the biography of a song. The Chicago Tribune has called The Promise and the Dream a fascinating and elegiac account, and the New York Times called it an engaging work of popular history. We are delighted to welcome as his interlocutor tonight one of the best interviewers in New York, Bud Mishkin. For 14 years, Bud was a favorite on New York One, host of One-on-One with Bud Mishkin, which I was telling someone today, I didn't quite get the title for about 10 years, but now I get it. One-on-One. And a weekly program as well, offering the last word on sports. And some of his fans miss both of those very much. Earlier, Bud worked on WOR-TV and WNBC Radio. He still conducts interviews at the 92nd Street Y, which I don't like to mention because they're kind of a big competitor of ours. As if he needed validation as one of the best practitioners of the interviewing art, He did achieve it. He has played TV reporters in 2 movies. It can happen to you and Noel, right? A final word, the words crafted and spoken by FDR as part of his State of the Union address in 1941 not only engaged Norman Rockwell and animated the exhibit we've mounted upstairs, they adorn the rear wall of this auditorium, and they inspired the renaming of the one-time family dining room, now the Four Freedoms Room, upstairs. Surely, they also inspired the work and the promise of Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert Kennedy, because they waged a very similar fight a quarter of a century after FDR, the fight to guarantee the freedom of speech and religion and eradicate freedom from fear and from want. In that spirit, we welcome in conversation David Margolick and Bud Mishkin.
Thank you, Harold. Welcome, everyone. We'll get to a discussion of my 2 films in about 5 minutes. David, welcome. Congratulations.
Well, thank you, Bud. It's a privilege to share this platform with you.
If you read anything that this gentleman writes, be it a book about Strange Fruit, the great Billie Holiday song, or the Louis Schmeling fight of 1938, or the 2 women in that famed photograph from Little Rock in 1957, it is about a moment, but the beauty of these books is that the context is just tremendous and beautifully written, and the same for The Promise and the Dream as well. These are 2 figures about whom much has been written. That's an understatement. With that in mind, going in, does that create a certain pressure? Because many of the stories, not necessarily the stories about the 2 of them and they're being interlinked, but the stories and the men are pretty well known.
Well, it was intimidating starting this because of the huge record for each of them. And it was a record in each case that I was vaguely familiar with, and I grew up thinking about these 2 men. But you have to get to square one before you can even deviate from the record and expand upon the record. So it was intimidating. The idea of mastering their lives and delving into the literature on this and coming up with a working knowledge of their lives was quite intimidating. And having reached that point, then I had, no one wants to rewrite what other people have done.
Right.
And there's no, it happens plenty. But it's not something that I wanted to do, and I was determined to make my own contribution to the literature, and so that's what I tried to do here. I mean, I tried to examine nooks and crannies that nobody else had looked at, and checked out sources that no one else had seen. And I also came to realize that there was very little on these 2 guys vis-a-vis one another. And that could have been because there wasn't that much to say, or that there was a lot to say, but no one had bothered to say it.
Did that surprise you, that when you started in the initial phase doing some investigating, that there's got to be a book about these 2 guys, right?
It surprised me that there was so little written about them.
Yeah.
And really, I mean, even in the basic King and Kennedy biographies, there's very little about their relationship. And I think that people were easily scared off in a way because there's no documentary record. There are very few letters between them. I mean, one of the challenges that I had doing this book, this was originally going to be a picture book. It was originally going to be published by the National Geographic, and it was going to be, I was doing the grouting, basically. I was writing the text that was going to go between a bunch of pictures. Little did they know that no writer wants to reduce his role to that. And the contract originally called for 40,000 words, and I ended up writing 120,000 words, which meant that some pictures had to get bumped. And in fact, there was an exhibition at the New York Historical Society of the outtakes, the photographs that were taken out of the book because I said too damn much.
Yeah. It's a topic that, as someone who has never sat down to write a book, but it's a topic that you say, okay, we're going to write about Bobby Kennedy and Martin Luther King Jr. that to reduce the number of words
Right.
seems to be pretty difficult.
Yeah, well, I mean, the interesting thing about the pictures is that there's really no good pictures of these two guys together.
Right.
All right. As huge as the historical record is, there are pictures of the two of them in groups. There's a famous picture of the two of them taken at the White House, but there are bunches of other people in that picture, and even that picture, there's a story behind that picture. King looks very, very uncomfortable in that picture, and for reasons that I can explain, whereas Bobby looks very confident and cocky. But the story of this book was going to be in the nooks and crannies and in the interstices. It wasn't going to be in the plain historic record, because there wasn't much of a historic record, and that was why one of the first interviews that I had for the book was with Kathleen Kennedy Townsend, the eldest child of Robert Kennedy. And she said to me right off the bat, my mother doesn't like me to tell this story because she thinks it'll discourage people from reading the book. She told me right off the bat, there's no book here. Don't do this book. There's no book. I mean, the fact that these two guys met one another a couple of times, that doesn't make a book out of it, And to me, that was a kind of challenge, because I knew that these were arguably the most important white and black man of the civil rights era of that whole period between 1960 and 1968. And there was a story here, because they were acutely aware of one another and very highly conscious of what one another was doing and thinking. But the story, the story was not going to be in anything obvious. It was going to be in all of this stuff behind the scenes, and that's where I was going to find it. And I knew that there were lots of sources, for instance, in the newspaper sources about these guys. In much of what's been written about them, particularly in recent years, and I mentioned this to Bud before when we were sitting around just talking. The New York Times has a kind of dominance in historiography in this country, and most researchers just sort of content themselves with reading the New York Times and the Washington Post when they're doing a story about this. Well, a lot of people in this crowd will remember that the most important newspaper arguably covering these guys, and certainly covering Robert Kennedy, was the New York Post. A very different New York Post, Dolly Schiff's New York Post, the liberal New York Post. But Murray Kempton was much more important than James Reston.
Right.
You had to read Murray Kempton. You had to read Jimmy Breslin in the news. You had to read Jimmy Wexler. Jimmy Wexler was the one who was following these guys. And the New York Post had, and this is just on Robert Kennedy. The Post was the only paper sort of covering, the only white paper really covering Martin Luther King. Why was that? Because the Post was the first paper in New York to have a serious black reporter, Ted Poston. And Ted Poston was down in Montgomery covering the bus boycott, which is something that the New York Times didn't do. So there were lots of sources that hadn't been consulted before. And I would only finish by saying that even the people who'd been interviewed a lot about these guys, and that, Andrew Young, John Lewis, Harry Belafonte, had never focused on the relationship between the two of them, so they had new things to say.
Had they focused on the notion that there were many of them who had relationships with both, and could go and could spend time with Bobby Kennedy, and certainly could spend time with Martin Luther King Jr.?
Well, there were really only a few of them who could go back and forth. There were very, very few people who knew them both well. Harry Belafonte was one. That's basically the whole list. Harry Belafonte, Andrew Young, and John Lewis. Yeah. And then a couple of other people. Marion Wright Edelman knew them both. Sure. There were a couple of people who were interlocutors between them, and just go-betweens between them, because, as I say, they had very little direct contact with one another.
So, under the heading of trying to find these nooks and crannies that have not been in previous books about either Bobby Kennedy or Martin Luther King Jr., can you give us an example or two of the writer as detective? You hear about something, is it true, is it not? And you track it down and you find this tidbit, this kernel that's not been reported elsewhere.
Well, there was, for instance, and this was one of the last interviews that I had with Andrew Young, he described, I was writing the introduction to the book, at the end of my writing. Once I'd figured out what I'd said in the book, then I could tailor the introduction to it. And I asked him about Bobby's speech in Indianapolis. I mean, this was the great moment tying these two guys together in the public mind. And people extrapolate from it to think that these two guys were very close. I mean, what's really noteworthy about that speech is that it was the only time that Robert Kennedy really ever spoke at length about Martin Luther King publicly. My own theory is that Martin Luther King was too dangerous for Bobby Kennedy to embrace to any significant degree. And it was only once King was dead that he could speak about him as affectionately and as extensively as he did that night. And he didn't speak about him again the rest of the campaign.
And he also spoke about that night about his brother being murdered.
He spoke that night about his brother. But I wanted, in my interview with Andrew Young, he described the experience of watching Bobby Kennedy give that speech that night. And watching it as he described it, they went back. This is how I start out the book because it's such a riveting moment in my mind. When they left the hospital after King had been declared dead, and they had to figure out what they were going to do next, where were they going to go? Well, the only place they really could go was the Lorraine Motel. That's where all their stuff was,
right.
And so when they had the meeting that night discussing what came next, it was in Martin Luther King's room. That's the room they were sitting in. And it was in that room that they watched Bobby Kennedy give his speech. And so here's Andrew Young describing this incredible moment, and he had never described it before to anybody. And, as a writer, you just, first of all, you feel you're just amazed that you're getting paid theoretically. You're getting paid to talk to people like this, and you're so grateful that they're making the time to speak with you, and it's such a privilege to hear them. And I thanked him, and I said, I'm so appreciative, I'm so grateful to you for sharing this with me. And he said, no, I'm grateful to you. I've written a memoir, but there's no way that I can get out. There's no way that I can tell all of the stories I have in me. You're rescuing this. You're prompting me to tell these stories that need to be preserved. So that's just one example. That story had never been told before. He also described Robert Kennedy arriving at Martin Luther King's funeral. And one of the first stops that he made was to visit Daddy King and to go up and commiserate with Daddy King the night that his son, the day after his son had been killed. I mean, imagine Bobby Kennedy and Daddy King together, and that's not even in Andrew Young's memoirs. So there's lots of stuff like that.
That's a pretty good day on the job.
Yeah, I felt very good about that one.
Yeah. There's a beautiful moment. People who are interested in the history have been told and read time and time again about how JFK calls Coretta Scott King in 1960 when Dr. King's in jail, and that was spoken about in every black church that Sunday, and
right.
that margin, 1960 was razor thin. Maybe that, had a huge effect. But Bobby Kennedy's call to Coretta Scott King in 1968 is a story that's not quite as well known, and it's written about beautifully in the book here, and how you describe what he did that was so different from every other phone call that came into her in the aftermath of Dr. King's assassination, and how it really spoke to who Bobby Kennedy was and what made him tick.
Well, Bobby Kennedy said, Bobby Kennedy had a sardonic sense of humor, and when he finally got through to her, he said, I know something about funerals, and I know something about planning funerals very quickly, and how can I help you? You're going to need extra phone lines in your house.
Yeah, because he said, I've been trying to get through to you for...
Yeah, right. You're going to need extra phone lines. I've already called the phone company. You're going to have 4 or 5 extra lines in your house. Start booking every room you can get in every hotel in Atlanta, because everybody is going to be coming in. And then, by the way, how are you going to come up here? Let's get you up here to accompany your husband's body back to Atlanta from Memphis. Let me get you a plane. Which he did. Even the White House didn't do that. Bobby Kennedy was really sort of unofficially already the president that night, acting as the president, and provided the plane that brought Coretta King up to Memphis and then back to Atlanta with Martin Luther King's body.
It's an interesting story, and it's written about beautifully in the book, but it almost points to, kind of who Bobby Kennedy was, or what made him tick in terms of he wanted to do things and not so much talk about it. One of his main problems with liberals was he always thought they just sit around and talk about things. They're not necessarily doing something,
right? Which
of course is a grand overgeneralization, but the notion of him getting on the phone and talking about emotions, not his style, getting on the phone and say, hey, let's do this, 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 and this, that was right up his alley.
He was very unsentimental about this kind of thing and very practical. Bobby Kennedy, I think, hated to be considered sentimental.
Right.
And it's one of the things that makes it difficult to write about him, because he was always sort of denying his racial sensitivity, for instance. He was always stressing to people that he didn't believe in differentiating between the races. Mm-hmm. There's an interview that he gave to the Kennedy Library. The Kennedys started recording all these oral histories as soon as JFK died, including an oral history that Bobby Kennedy gave. And the interviewer was Anthony Lewis. And who was very friendly with Bobby Kennedy, one of many reporters who was really arguably too friendly with Bobby Kennedy, very cozy with Bobby Kennedy. And Bobby Kennedy had that effect on reporters. And Lewis, sort of like a typical liberal reporter, was trying to get Bobby Kennedy to describe his evolving racial attitudes. And when did you'll remember this, when did you first realize that blacks had it terrible in this country, and that special measures were needed to fix the problem of civil rights in this country? And Bobby Kennedy kept foiling him and saying, in our house we didn't discuss those. We didn't look at it that way. There were poor people and there were rich people. Some were black, some were white. I didn't look at any of this through a racial prism. And he was always sort of backing off of that. I mean, a lot of his rhetoric, as you say, is very conservative,
right.
Bobby Kennedy's rhetoric.
And yet, was it during the California primary, or obviously during the lead up to the California primary, where he meets with Black Panthers and black militants, and he basically says to some of his aides, you have the quote in the book about, look, I'm paraphrasing here, they've been screwed over for a long time.
Yeah.
White people are just going to have to listen for a while.
Well, that's right, and he was, again, he's confusing. It's hard sometimes to read him, and he went through several different stages, sometimes in the same experience, sometimes in the same event. In all of these things, and the most famous example of that, there's another quote in the book where he's meeting with the people in Bud Schulberg's writer's workshop in Los Angeles that he set up in Watts after the riots. And Kennedy says, I don't want any Uncle Toms. I don't want to meet with any of them. I'm not going to learn anything from them. Bring me some militants. Bring me some people who are really going to challenge me. And that's the way. The most famous example of that is, of course, the meeting that he had with James Baldwin in 1963. And that's a famous story, but told a bit more fully in the book, because it was such an important moment in his life, and it was one that I wanted to document from every imaginable source. And this was where he invited James Baldwin down to Hickory Hill to his house in Virginia, because he wanted to understand what black intellectuals were thinking. Mm-hmm. He was reaching out in a way that no one else in the Kennedy administration did. Or could have.
This is before his brother got assassinated.
This is in June of this is in May of 1963. Mm-hmm. So he has this short meeting with Baldwin in Virginia, and it's because Baldwin is late, they don't get very far in the meeting, and so Kennedy says, well, listen, I'm flying up to New York tomorrow. He didn't say this, but it was his brother's birthday. Mm-hmm. It was not the happy birthday, Mr. President Marilyn Monroe birthday. I think it was. It must have been the year after. Must have been the year after that, 1963.
Right.
And he said, I'm coming up there, And maybe you can arrange a meeting with, just gather some of your friends and we'll meet at my father's apartment. Joe Kennedy had an apartment on Central Park South. And we'll talk things over. Let me hear from some of your friends. And James Baldwin assembled this group. Harry Belafonte was in the group. It was purposely not the usual civil rights leaders that he would normally have met with. And I think he was a little bit impatient with them. He thought they were too mainstream in a way, and he wanted people who were out there a little bit more, either the radicals that you were describing or that he wanted to meet with Bud Schulberg, or sort of more hefty intellectual people. So he had Baldwin gather. Harry Belafonte was there. Lorraine Hansberry was there. Lena Horne was there. All of these different people. But the most notable guy was a former freedom rider named Jerome Smith. And Kennedy started bragging about everything that had been going on and everything the administration was doing. This was after Birmingham, the Birmingham protests. And Jerome Smith got up and basically said, "You're full of it. We don't need to hear any of this. This is all just nonsense. Look what's happened to me." He had just been beaten brutally during one of the freedom rides in Mississippi, and the Justice Department was nowhere. The FBI didn't do anything. Nobody was protecting him. And he said, "You talk a good game, but you're not protecting us." And of course, at that point, everybody rallied to his side, and the meeting turned very vituperative. And Kennedy got very angry about it. He was very bitter about it afterwards. He denounced all of the people at the meeting. Who are these people? They don't realize what we're doing. They don't understand anything about the law. They're all married to whites anyway. I mean, of what consequence? He started denigrating them. He made various sort of nasty comments about Baldwin and some of the other people at the meeting, and he was very bitter about it for a few days. And then things started to sink in with him, and he made the comment to somebody that if he had been a freedom rider who had had the stuffing beaten out of him, he might feel the same way that Jerome Smith did. Right. And so he went through stages, and he started to think about all of this and process all of it. And it was only a couple of weeks later that John Kennedy gave his famous civil rights speech, one of the great speeches of his presidency, in which he called for the enactment for the first time, called for the enactment of an ambitious civil rights bill. And Bobby Kennedy is generally the one who's credited with awakening his brother's consciousness to this. So he wasn't simple. He wasn't a saint. And I make this point. I just had a story that appeared in The Guardian. I'm writing several stories now that are not in the book, just because there's extra stuff that I couldn't get in a book about the relationship between these two guys. And I re-interviewed some of Bobby's speechwriters. This is a story about Bobby Kennedy's encounter with Allen Ginsberg. Okay, now, who would think that Bobby would have met with Allen Ginsberg? But Allen Ginsberg showed up at Bobby Kennedy's Senate office one day, and nobody would have let Allen Ginsberg in, but Bobby not only invited him in, but met with him and listened to him, and it's a very interesting story. And one of Bobby's speechwriters was there one day, Adam Walensky, whom many of you will remember, and he said, in so many words, I'm reading about Bobby Kennedy these days, and everybody's making him sound like Mother Teresa. He wasn't Mother Teresa. He was a very tough guy, and these experiences, these interactions that he had, reflect the many forces tugging at him.
Right. In the Mishkin household, he was never forgiven for being one of McCarthy's guys.
Right. Yeah.
You could talk about Camelot till the cows came home. It was like that was one of the standard things in our household.
Well, that's and
which makes, but to the writer, is there any more compelling character?
Yeah, that's right. And one of the things that I hadn't realized, although it makes perfect sense, and it's a story that Harry Belafonte told me, that as radioactive as anybody associated with Joe McCarthy would be in a house like yours or mine, he was even more suspect in the black intellectual world. Why? Because Du Bois was a communist. Paul Robeson was a communist. People who were heroes in that community were, if they weren't actual communists, were leftists. Right? And so McCarthyism and anti-communism was to them code for racism. So there was an additional layer of antipathy and skepticism toward Bobby Kennedy in that community, which was why Martin Luther King was so horrified that when Bobby Kennedy was named Attorney General, right? Not just for reasons of nepotism, but because of where he had been, and why everybody else was sort of bad-mouthing Bobby Kennedy in King's presence, and King said to them, I don't want to hear any of this. This man is going to be the Attorney General of the United States. We have to work with him. I want you to go out and find his moral center. Find his moral center and don't come back to me until you have, because he's all we got here. He's going to be our liaison. He's going to be our path to John F. Kennedy. He's going to be the one that John F. Kennedy listens to, and we better damn well learn to work with him.
It's fascinating. There is a bit in the book, I just want to read it. It's talking about Bobby Kennedy here in, I believe, 1966, and you write, asked whether he'd run for president in 1972, he'd say something like, quote, 6 years is so far away, tomorrow is far away, I don't even know if I'll be alive in 6 years, end quote. It was fatalistic, though Kennedy's fatalism and King's were very different. How so?
Well, I think that Bobby Kennedy was fatalistic over a longer term. His fatalism was longer term than Martin Luther King's. I think Bobby Kennedy thought he had the luxury to think about 1972, whereas King was looking over his shoulder continually. And I think that King felt that his life could be snuffed out at any moment, whereas Kennedy felt that it had happened once and it could happen again, but probably thought that it wasn't going to happen again. I mean, he was well aware of the contingencies, but I think didn't think of it as imminent in the same way. And I'm emboldened to think that because, you know, sometimes you get interesting perspectives from different kinds of observers. I talked to Harry Benson, the photographer, and Harry Benson photographed both of these guys, and he described how in their presence they looked very different. Bobby Kennedy was not looking anxiously around when Benson was watching him. He wasn't checking out the crowd. His advance men may have been doing it, but he wasn't. Whereas King was constantly looking out and seeing who was out there and what looked menacing to him, and was much more mindful of how fragile things were for him. Bobby Kennedy was kind of contemptuous of security. He had only one bodyguard, really, a former FBI guy whose job was really just to kind of hold on to him. You know, you've all seen this film footage, which is in all the documentaries now, of Bobby Kennedy standing in a car and everybody reaching out and pulling him. And his bodyguard, part of his bodyguard's job was to hold on to him so that he wouldn't be pulled out of a moving car. But I think that Bobby wasn't obsessed moment to moment. He was fatalistic, but he wasn't obsessed moment to moment with his security.
Harry Benson, a great photographer, a great New Yorker by way of his native Scotland, who had befriended the Kennedys, but was in the room when Bobby Kennedy was shot, and has told me about you have to take the photograph.
Yeah, that's right.
And that Ethel tried to stop him.
Well, that's the famous picture of Ethel holding her hand up.
Right.
Yeah.
And, you know, take the photograph now.
Think about it tomorrow.
Right,
Yeah.
right. On a happier day in his career, he's also the photographer who's in the hotel in Paris in January 1964 when the Beatles find out that I Want to Hold Your Hand is number one in America.
And they said they wouldn't. The pillow fight.
Right, and they said they wouldn't go to America until they had number one because so many British acts had faltered here. So they had already been signed to do Sullivan. It was in February next month, but we'll go when we have a number one. And Brian Epstein tells them, I Want to Hold Your Hand is number one, and they proceed to have a pillow fight, and he's the guy that takes the photograph of the pillow fight.
I think that Harry Benson was also the one who told me that one of the problems in photographing King was that he always looked the same. You know, that King was always serious. He could never let his guard down.
Right.
And I think that's absolutely true, that for a black man, even a black leader in that era, he always had his appearances always had to be beyond reproach, and he couldn't relax, and so he always maintains a certain kind of dignity, and could never really loosen up except when he was with his own friends. And I sort of theorize in the book about Kennedy gives this famous speech in Indianapolis the night that King is killed. What would have happened if King had given a speech the night that Kennedy was killed, if King had lived to do that? And I think it wouldn't have been nearly as famous, and it wouldn't have been off the cuff, and he would have been much more uptight, and he would have felt that the world was watching him, and he just wouldn't have felt he had the liberty to really open up in the way that Bobby Kennedy did.
It's also about the circumstance. He's in a black neighborhood in Indianapolis. Yeah. He decides, I'm going forward, going to do this. One other note about the premonition of death, which obviously plays a big role in the book. You write, somewhat early on, it loomed over King far longer, when you talk about the two of them, it loomed over King far longer, so long that he had a chance to devise and polish what he said about it. Quote, so I'm not afraid of anybody this morning, he said. If I had to die tomorrow morning, I would die happy because I've been to the mountaintop and I've seen the promised land. It sounds like April 1968 in Memphis. In fact, it was January 1957 in Montgomery. That's a beautiful piece of writing.
Well, it's sort of, it was an eye-opening fact, that he'd been saying these things for a very long time, and I think, part of my job as a journalist, I won't even say a historian, but as a journalist, is just to pop bubbles in a way, and I think that there are a lot of there's a lot of knowing commentary. People, you watch the documentaries now on television and everything fits in very neatly, and people will show that incredible speech. I mean, it's just an incredible speech, the I've been to the mountaintop speech, the night before he was killed, and say very conveniently that, suddenly he had this premonition the night before. But, it's important to know that he'd been thinking about it and even articulating it and using the same lines, long before he said them that night.
When you talk about those little moments that you're looking to find to flesh the story out, I was blessed a few years ago to do a night at another venue here in New York City that shall not be named. Yeah. It's kind of like the Voldemort of, I had to throw that in for my daughter, who's a big Harry Potter fan. And it was Harry Belafonte and Clarence Jones, who was Dr. King's attorney and speechwriter, and in a sentence I never really thought I'd hear in my lifetime, Mr. Belafonte called me and said, can Julian Bond come? Yeah. I believe he'll be allowed. Yeah, I believe that would be okay. The reason I mention it is because we can talk about the greater truths, but there are these little moments that get remembered, and so I said to him, is there something that you remember from that day, 50 years ago, March on Washington? And he said he was responsible for getting the celebrities sodas. Celebrities were there like Charlton Heston and Brando and Paul Newman. And so Sammy Davis Jr. says, hey kid, can you get me a Coke? And so Julian Bond, who's maybe 21 at that point, hands Sammy Davis Jr. a Coke, and Sammy Davis Jr. goes, thanks kid. And that's what he remembers from the March on Washington, or the late, a blessed memory, Julian Bond. It's like, and in these great historic moments, there are the small moments.
Well, there are these little details. For instance, I would imagine that when he handed him the Coke, it was not a Coke bottle. Now, why would it not have been a Coke bottle? Because they thought that they couldn't have any bottles there because people would start throwing them. And so everything was in paper cups. And this was all part of the planning, Robert Kennedy's planning for the March on Washington. I mean, the thing was very closely monitored by Robert Kennedy's Justice Department, and it left very little to chance. And that was just one. They were ready to pull the plug on the speakers if the speeches got unruly.
Right.
And the Kennedy administration was initially very much opposed to the March on Washington. Then when it realized it was going to happen, it did its best to co-opt it and control it.
And breathe a huge sigh of relief.
And breathe a huge sigh of relief afterward.
Can you tell me about the story behind the flight with the three widows?
Well, this is another moment. I'm just writing a story about it now. Again, to keep things moving in the book, I couldn't digress very long into any one of these episodes. But there's this incredible moment when they bring Bobby Kennedy's body back from Los Angeles to New York. People thought originally the funeral was going to be in New York, but it was by Ethel's decree, it was at St. Patrick's, as again, many of you here will remember. And LBJ sent out the plane, Air Force One, one of the Air Force Ones, to bring the body back. Probably gnawed at LBJ to have to do that, given his relationship with Bobby Kennedy, but he did it, did the right thing. When the family got to LAX to board the plane, Jackie Kennedy initially refused to get on it because she thought it was the same plane that had brought her back with JFK's body from Dallas. And got on only when she was assured that it was not the same Air Force One. It was the Air Force One that had Dean Rusk and others on and was flying to Tokyo on November 22nd, 1963, and turned around over the Pacific when word of the Kennedy assassination came through. Anyway, it was a flight. What was extraordinary about the flight was that the three widows, the three most famous widows in America, Ethel Kennedy, Jackie Kennedy, and Coretta King, were all on this flight. And when I first heard that, and even now, I get goosebumps thinking about it. And it's another hidden story in all of this. It's never really been described. It's very difficult to describe because there's not much on it. Nobody really talked very much about it afterwards, and there was kind of a wave of discretion. People were very protective of the Kennedys and didn't say very much about it afterwards, but I'm busy assembling now every fragment I can get about this flight. And those of you who look at the book or buy the book, you'll see on the inside jacket here, this book was done on the fly in a lot of ways, and this was done at the printers. You'll see this is the flight manifest from that flight. One of the advance men at the airport was handed it and saved it all these years and let me use it and reprint it. And so it's got a list of all of the different passengers on the flight, starting with Ethel Kennedy and three children, Jackie Kennedy, Edward Kennedy, Frank Mankiewicz, Richard Goodwin, who just died the other day, Rayford Johnson, Roosevelt Greer. They're all listed as being on the flight. Number 4 is Ethel Kennedy. Number 5 is Jackie Kennedy. Number 56 is Mrs. Martin Luther King. And it's just, I'm having a hard time, actually, and maybe some of you will have some suggestions for me. I think that nowadays, something like this would have been covered from top to bottom. You know, in the cable TV culture, a moment like this, a juxtaposition of these three people would have been covered upside down. But in fact, this one was not. There's commentary. There's a little bit of commentary out there, but not very much. And again, there's no picture of the three of them together. There's only a mental picture from one eyewitness that I've found, you know, sort of linking the three of them together. But that's something that I'm trying to assemble as a great moment in American history. And I was thinking that they're really the three most famous widows in American history. But with Harold Holzer here, I don't want to make any categorical statement because Eleanor Roosevelt was a famous widow for many years, right? And Mary Todd Lincoln, and I have to get her in.
That's right.
At least 5 of Harold's 60 books are about Mary Todd Lincoln. But I think they were certainly, I would imagine that 3 of the most famous widows in 20th century America were on that flight together, and it deserves to be documented.
Well, absolutely. You make the point, though, about now, if it happened, but now people would talk a lot about it without saying anything.
Right. Yeah, that's right.
There'd be a lot of noise, and the beauty of the good journalist, the good historian, is to take this event, and when you realize, wait a minute, these 3 women are on the plane together. I've read a pretty decent amount about that period of history. I have not read about this.
Yeah.
And then you make it come alive. There's worth in that, no matter what generation we're in. One more thing, and then we'll get to your questions in a Q&A. Another tidbit that I had never connected before. Yes, we've connected that Sirhan was upset with Bobby Kennedy's policy as far as the Middle East is concerned. I did not get that the timing and the one-year anniversary of the Six-Day War had something to do with why Bobby Kennedy was assassinated when he was. That one really, sorry.
And saying that RFK...
Trust me, it'll still read beautifully.
Yeah,
but
saying that RFK must die by the 5th of June, which was the anniversary of the Six-Day War.
At the risk of unveiling some state secrets, where did that one come from?
Well, because he was very much he was Palestinian.
Yeah.
And he was very much concerned about Robert Kennedy's position on Israel.
I understand that, but for you as like kind of the detective, where...
Something that I got to say that didn't surprise me so much, only because I know that I didn't want to go down that particular hole of assassination conspiracies and theories and all of that. But I remembered that Sirhan had said RFK must die, and that he'd been concerned about. Bobby Kennedy had given a speech in a synagogue in Portland, Oregon during the Oregon primary, in which he voiced support for selling fighter jets to Israel, and Sirhan was following all of this. And so Sirhan's feelings about Israel and the Six-Day War, that part didn't surprise me.
Right.
What surprised me was that was something else that I found about him, which was that Sirhan, who lived in Pasadena, was friendly with a local sanitation man.
Oh, that's right.
Right? And the sanitation man would come by, and Sirhan would give him soda and Coke and sandwiches when he came by to pick up the garbage. And in April, after Martin Luther King was shot, Sirhan was very indignant about it. I mean, you don't think of Sirhan with the King assassination, but Sirhan was very upset about the assassination of Martin Luther King, and he talked to the sanitation man who was black about it, okay, and expressed his outrage about what could be done about this now, that King had been shot. It's just a side of Sirhan that you don't think about. It's a juxtaposition. And the topic then changed to politics, and the California primary was underway, and they started talking about who was going to vote for whom. And the sanitation man said, there's no choice, I'm going to vote for Robert Kennedy in the California primary. And Sirhan said to him, you're not going to get the chance, I'm going to kill him before then.
Yeah.
And that was in April.
Right.
That was in April. Now, how that fits into the various conspiracy theories and Robert Kennedy Jr. and all of that, which I don't really want to get into because it's a morass, that I don't pretend to be an authority on. And whether or not this was an ex post facto story that was set up in order to inculpate Sirhan, I don't know any of that. I just know that came up during that story came up during the investigation, and there was one more way in which to tie these two guys together.
Sure. Okay, we have a microphone, I believe. All right, and so please, when you ask your question, please wait for the microphone. So why don't you come up to the front here? We're going to start here on our left, your right. And again, if you have a question, obviously, just raise your hand and we'll give you the microphone. Yes?
So you told us a little bit about the handful of people who interacted in a meaningful way with both of them. You did not include, I don't know if you were only talking about people who are still alive or not, but you did not include Lyndon Johnson. And I'm just wondering about that because I would have assumed it would be true for Johnson either privately with one and the other, and perhaps even together. I wonder if there's any record in history of the three of them meeting together and what you might know about that.
No, I'm trying to think. I don't think that the three. I can't, except in those group sessions. First of all, when the Kennedys were still around, Lyndon Johnson wasn't saying very much in the presence of the Kennedys. That was part of his humiliation, and so I don't think that there were any meaningful moments with the three of them. I mean, I was referring only to potential sources, okay? Because otherwise, I would have mentioned J. Edgar Hoover, who clearly interacted with both of them. And in fact, on Hoover's hate list, the top three, Kennedy and King were two of his top three. He hated them both. The third was some FBI guy that he'd had a fight with. So, I mean, there were other people, but I think that even they wouldn't have dealt intimately with the two of them in the way that Belafonte did and Andrew Young did. And even Belafonte and Young, their interactions They were really more go-betweens than they were people who were present for a lot of sessions between these two guys. They were really interlocutors more than they were participants.
Yes, right over here.
Thank you for that series of really fascinating and eye-opening vignettes. I'm wondering if you dealt at all with the speech that Bobby Kennedy gave in Cape Town, South Africa in spring of 1966, which I had something to do with, and whether that informed his overall sensitivities and sensibilities on racial issues, and particularly what motivated him, if you got into that at all, to accept the invitation from the South African Student Union to go in the first place, since it was really quite a diversion from his other preoccupation.
I do go into it because it didn't directly affect, it wasn't part of the interchange between these two guys. I didn't break a lot of new ground discussing it, but I think it was a very important part of his evolution, the evolution that he was going through then. It wasn't a diversion for him, it was part of his growing sensitivity toward injustice, and it was really part of what was becoming his mainstream pursuit as a senator. It was an extraordinary thing to do, but it was part of his speaking out on injustice. So in that sense, it wasn't that much of a diversion at all for him. And it turns out, I think Adam Wolinski told me that when he went to South Africa, because Wolinski went with him, right, and when I think, and this can't be documented and there's no record of it, but Wolinski thought that when he went and met with Chief Lutuli, the Nobel Prize winning black South African leader, he brought a letter from Martin Luther King with him. And that's in the book, but it's only speculative. So there was, again, a wonderful connection between the two men. And so I write some about the speech. The speech, it's actually, it's a great speech. I was less interested in it than I was in the Indianapolis speech, because Bobby Kennedy had great speech writers. And I sort of view it as a less authentic instance of Bobby Kennedy expressing himself than really just reading the eloquence of his speech writers, unlike the speech in Indianapolis. Mm-hmm. So in a way, I was less interested in it. I mean, it happens to be very topical, because when I asked Adam Wolinski, who wrote the famous line about the ripple of hope and radiating out the ripples of hope when you talk and act against injustice, he said it was not he, but Richard Goodwin, who died the other day, who wrote that line. So it's a great moment in the evolution of Robert Kennedy. It touches peripherally on Martin Luther King, but it wasn't really part of the Kennedy-King story. So it's like his visit to the Mississippi Delta, also in all of the documentaries, and also a seminal moment in the Robert Kennedy story and part of Robert Kennedy's evolution, but a story told in other places, including in a wonderful new book devoted solely to the visit to the Mississippi Delta, and less I tried to confine myself to those moments where Kennedy and King were rubbing up against one another and watching one another very intently. So they're in there, but I wouldn't pretend that I'm saying a lot that's dramatically new about either of those episodes in the book.
Other questions? Yes, right over here, please. We will get to everybody.
You sound like Anthony Scaramucci that day.
I'm fascinated by the Three Widows on One Plane. And you mentioned that Coretta Scott King was number 56. How many were on that plane, and how many of those on that manifest are still living or were living so that you could interview them? And if you indeed interviewed every single one of them, did anyone have an anecdote even about them chatting in the aisle? Did anyone remember the three of them, or two out of the three of them, interacting in the plane?
You know something, Letty? Read my story in a few days. I don't want to telegraph what I have, okay? Because it's such an interesting story. But I'll say that most of the people on the flight are gone. The largest collection of people on the flight who are still around are the Kennedys themselves. Robert Kennedy's 3 oldest children were on the flight. Theoretically, would have been good sources. And again, I stress the word theoretically, because they didn't share their memories with me. The best source of all would have been Ethel Kennedy. I never spoke to Ethel Kennedy about that or anything else. I mean, it's understandable that she might not want to talk about that. I don't begrudge her that. Jean Kennedy Smith, the last surviving Kennedy sibling, was on the flight. But the overwhelming majority of people, most everybody is gone, and very few of them recorded anything about it. I did find maybe 4 or 5 people who were on it. Part of the problem in reporting about it is that, again, a lot of you will remember that Robert Kennedy was shot at about 12:30 in the morning on June 5th and died 24 hours later, and everybody had been up for 2 straight nights. And so people just slept on that flight. You know, there was a lot that went on that no one saw. You know, people just were too wiped out. But I think I have some interesting material on it, and I'm hoping that it's out sometime in the next few days.
Yes, just right behind you, and then we'll go over there. If you could just pass the microphone right there. Yeah.
Thank you. All the while that Jack Kennedy was president and Bobby Kennedy was Attorney General, J. Edgar Hoover was investigating Martin Luther King. Can you speak a little bit about what that investigation meant to King and how it affected his relationship with the Kennedys?
Well, of course, it's actually the story is a little bit surprising. The Kennedys were very wary of, as I say, of Martin Luther King. He posed a political peril to them. I mean, as Bud said, he got John F. Kennedy elected. You know, when they made that phone call and got him out of prison. Again, Bobby Kennedy was originally horrified by that phone call, but changed on a dime and then ended up getting him sprung by calling up the judge. Again, Bobby Kennedy adapting to the situation and fighting his initial instinct and doing the right thing, and it happened to be politically the right thing. It offended maybe some southern voters, but it helped carry all these northern states that tip things to JFK. So King got him elected, but posed great perils to the Kennedys. The perils were in part that King was associated with communists, former communists, his advisors, notably Stanley Levison. And the Kennedys were constantly afraid that J. Edgar Hoover was just going to sort of out King and derail the Kennedys' program. And so, when people say that Bobby Kennedy wiretapped King, but he sort of held his nose and was very reluctant, I would take issue with that. I mean, I don't think he was reluctant. I think that he did it as he recognized it as a matter of political necessity. That King represented danger to them, and they needed to know what King was up to. And it was realpolitik, it was hardball, and it wasn't something that he did particularly reluctantly. He waited a while to do it because it represented certain dangers if it ever got out. But when the time came, and they were worried about passing the Civil Rights Bill and all of that, he signed the authorization, And when he's asked about it, it's very curious. I mean, he's asked in this same oral history that Anthony Lewis took of Bobby Kennedy, he talks about signing. He's not even sure when he did it, but he says, "Yeah, and one time I authorized a wiretap on him. We needed to find out what he was up to, and what his associations were." He was very casual about it, and not at all apologetic about it, So there are these stories about how he was stricken when it all came out in the 1968 election and the primary campaign in California, and when Drew Pearson wrote about it and all of this. And I don't think that's true. I think he recognized that, politics was a serious business, and they needed it to protect King himself and the program, and to keep the program. They needed to know what was going on. Now, how did King feel about it? Well, King was prepared to endorse Robert Kennedy in 1968. Why was that? Because King recognized that Robert Kennedy had evolved and could potentially be a great leader. The man that this whole fuss was about, Stanley Levison, King's former communist and really one of his most crucial advisors, worked, I think either gave money or worked for Robert Kennedy in 1968. Okay? The Freedom Rider who was beaten, and who chewed Robert Kennedy out at that meeting with James Baldwin, was ready to vote for Robert Kennedy in 1968. All of these people understand, but just to go back, all of these people forgave Kennedy for what he had done because they realized the pressures he was operating under and what he had become and what he might yet become. And so I think that my impression is that Martin Luther King did not take it personally and did not bear him a grudge and was prepared to work with him. And of course, one of the great questions is what they could have done together.
We have time for one more question. And gentlemen on this side, please.
Yeah, I got beaten to it. I was going to ask you about the 60 campaign and the phone call. And my question really is, there's that standard view in Theodore White's great book and in David Wolper's documentary. But is there a little more to it than that? Just the outrage that Robert Kennedy had, what the interplay was between him and Coretta Scott King, and how he convinced, or how it came to be that he convinced President Kennedy to make the call, since he had doubts about it originally.
Well, he wasn't involved in making the call to Coretta King. He was opposed to making the call. He was horrified by the call was made at the suggestion of Harris Wofford, who was the civil rights advisor for the Kennedys, and Bobby learned about it only after the fact, and he called in Wofford, and I'm trying to remember whether it was Lewis Martin or one of the other Kennedy advisors, and said, "We're going to close up your whole civil rights operation in this campaign. You just lost us the election." That's how upset he was, and Sergeant Shriver said, "I've never been bawled out." Sergeant Shriver was also involved in making this call, and he said, "I've never been reamed out as much as Bobby just chewed me out. I've never experienced anything like this before." That's how angry, apoplectic Bobby was over it. And then the story is that, and there are different stories about it, and there's a lot of mythology. I mean, the story is that Bobby was upset, and Bobby was sort of a stickler for the law. Bobby was upset that King could have been thrown in jail for a minor probation violation, and that's what he was flying to New York, and he was I forget what he was doing in New York, maybe making a camp. I forget what he was doing, but he on the flight, it occurred to him that this was a terrible injustice, and he pulled over off the Long Island Expressway and called the judge and said, "Who are you and how can you do this?" That's one theory, okay, and he chewed out the judge. There's another story that the conversation was more amicable than that, and he later invited the judge to visit him at the White House. I don't know what the actual story is, but Bobby comes in after the fact, calls up the judge, and the judge springs King and gets him out of prison.
Perhaps it's, as it comes down to so often in this book with Bobby Kennedy, just a simple case of what he thought was right and wrong. Perhaps, as we can all appreciate, anybody would like to get off the Long Island Expressway.
Right, yeah.
Two quick last things from me, and that is, I've had the pleasure and privilege of interviewing, for the past, say, 20 years, Rosie Greer, a great football player who became a confidant.
If I would have known that, I had questions you could have asked him for me.
And Rayford Johnson.
And Rayford Johnson, I never caught up with. I could never talk to him.
Well, this was a while ago, a good 15, 20 years ago.
The people who were still alive on that flight, both of them.
The reason I raise it is and they're both in the room when Bobby Kennedy was shot. And so when I raised it, and probably we're talking about like 1996, 1997, it could have been yesterday.
Yeah.
And so my question is, in talking to the people, about both of these gentlemen is there a visceral sense of, okay, we are talking about a piece of history here, but man, it's just like it was yesterday.
I think they feel that way, and I feel that way. You know, it doesn't. It's astonishing to think that it's 50 years ago.
Right.
It seems so much fresher than that.
Yeah.
You know, to me, and they speak about it. I mean, if you hear Belafonte or Andrew Young or Clarence Jones, who you mentioned before, who's also got very vivid memories of all of this, talk about it, I mean, it has a freshness to them, and their passion and their indignation and their sorrow
Right.
come through vividly and undiminished. You know, it's not bottled up. It's not pickled. I mean, it's
Right.
very fresh.
Right. And you mentioned, or we started this conversation, you mentioned one of the Kennedy children saying to you, there's no story here.
Yeah.
There's no book here. As it becomes clear to you that this is not going to be a picture book, okay, and no disrespect to that format, and that you've really got something here, are there moments, are there nights when you're writing, when you yourself wondered or had doubts, do I have something here?
No. No, I knew that even if there wasn't something, I'd find something.
There you go.
I'd make something, and I did.
Yeah. Well, you made more than something. It's The Promise and the Dream, the untold story of Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert F. Kennedy. It is a must-read. Thank you for being here tonight.
Thank you, Bud. Thank you all.